I wanted to do a short video, um, really just for my own sort of organizing my thoughts. I recently wrote a paper for the Journal of Personal Cyber Consciousness, which we're still sort of in the editing phase of that, but hopefully that will come out in the next month or two. Um, the purpose of this video is not to dive into that paper specifically. I might do another video on that um, if the mood strikes me. But that paper was basically uh, supporting the notion of electromagnetic fields as being the substrate for phenomenological experience, which is a view pushed by John Joe Mcfadden and Susan Pockett, among others. Um, so my paper was sort of arguing for that point of view, and then I went further with an original idea of my own, which was to use the notion of Shannon entropy as a way to test if either biological or potentially future artificial intelligence systems had some level of consciousness or otherwise sentience. Um, and basically, my thought was that if we see a potentially conscious system as being some sort of recurrent neural net, similar to a Hopfield neural network, um, we could measure the hidden state Shannon entropy and compare it with the output state Shannon entropy, which is basically a measure of informational complexity. So if the internal informational complexity was bigger than the external informational complexity, that would be at least a candidate for being a conscious system. We can't really prove it positively, but maybe we could rule it out. Like if the hidden state Shannon entropy was not the same as the output, was less than the output state Shannon entropy, then that could be ruled out as consciousness. Okay, so anyway, so that was basically what that paper was about, and that's still kind of in the editing phase. I might do a deeper dive, another video about that, because that's like a deeper thing. What I wanted to do here was moving along with the idea of phenomenological experience being the uh, a product, if you will, of electromagnetic fields of the neocortex in the brain. Um, the question arises: is this sort of epiphenomenal, or is it causal? Right? Meaning, are the electromagnetic fields sort of along for the ride of the neural networks of the neocortex, or are they engaged in sort of contributing to the process in some way? And there's two sides to that. The parsimonious side, meaning sort of the principle of parsimony in science tends to be good. Don't add more things to the theory than you need to. Kind of like Occam's razor, simplest explanation is the right one. Parsimoniously, one would want to tend towards saying that these electromagnetic fields of the neocortex don't really contribute very much compared to just the mechanics of the neural networks, specifically in the neocortex. So the principle of parsimony would impel one towards saying that this is purely epiphenomenal. That said, if it's completely epiphenomenal, you have sort of the opposite, a different problem with natural selection. Why would natural selection sort of allow this through the filter, so to speak, if it's purely epiphenomenal? If it doesn't help or contribute to behavior to selective advantage, then why wasn't this sort of weeded out a long time ago? Why weren't these electromagnetic fields of the brain somehow damped out in some way or whatever? Um, there is some evidence to suggest ephaptic influence. Ephaptic meaning um, the cell membranes of the neocortex, the neurons of the neocortex, are impacted on the order, less than an order of a millivolt, a very small amount of electricity by these magnetic fields. And it's probably on the order of 10 milliseconds, 5 milliseconds, something like that. So for very short amounts of time and for very small amounts of charge, uh, there can be some influence. And if we take some back of the envelope numbers, say um, in a 24-hour period, say if you're awake for 24 hours, you experience in the vicinity of 4 million bits of conscious experience. Now, these are back of the envelope numbers. Um, but say, you know, maybe a third of that is whatever that is, 1.3 million or something like that. So maybe if you're awake for 8 hours, it's 1.3 million. But whatever it is, let's just go with the 4 million number. You experience 4 million ish, 4 to 5 million, maybe we'll round that up to 5 million bits of information suitably defined. Uh, if you're awake for 24 hours, maybe about 1% of that. Okay, so what is that like? Uh, 40 or 50,000 bits are of conscious experience are the result of this ephaptic coupling, meaning the influence of the magnetic fields on the synapses. In other words, most of conscious experience is almost like bearing witness, if you will, to what the neurons are doing. Okay, so if the conscious experience is in these magnetic fields themselves, then it's mostly a matter of bearing witness, right? Um, if I'm gesturing with my right hand right now, it's not so much that I'm gesturing with my right hand, it's I'm observing or bearing witness to the motor neurons of my brain causing my right hand to gesture, right? It's kind of a weird thing. It's kind of an epiphenomenal thing. However, like I said, it's not completely epiphenomenal because there has to be a selective advantage. And what I would say is this small percentage, this 1% of information processed, has to do with perception. That what this ephaptic coupling does, what this sort of 1% of the total activity of the neocortex being influenced by these magnetic fields do, um, is it speeds up, potentially speeds up uh, convergence of various sensory inputs so that we can recognize objects maybe 5-10 milliseconds faster. um, Now that might not sound like a lot, 5, 10, maybe 20 milliseconds. But if the magnetic fields of our brain can help us recognize a poisonous state 10 or 20 milliseconds quicker, that might be the difference between life and death. It might be the difference between being weeded out or surviving long enough to pass along our genes, right? So, uh, whereas I would suggest consciousness is mostly epiphenomenal, sort of along for the ride, there is a small influence of consciousness on, well, of consciousness of the electromagnetic fields, which are conscious, on the sort of the neuron firing and especially the convergence, i.e., the learning rate of the neural network. So, in other words, if one part of my brain sees a sort of cylindrical object and another part of my brain sees a certain color pattern, and these things are bound together to give me the final perception of a snake, uh, that process could be speeded up very slightly by the influence of the magnetic fields. Okay, so that would give a selective reason of why these electromagnetic fields aren't, damped out. Why we aren't just sort of philosophical zombies. Um, we're not philosophical zombies in this view because there is a selective advantage to having these magnetic fields, which carry the phenomenological content, allowed to sort of roam freely and influence back upon the neurons, which will help speed up its learning rate, speed up its convergence rate, speed up its ability to snitch random bits of information together into a coherent framework to help us perceive things more quickly. Okay, I'm not a neuroscientist. I come from a computer science background, so my brain knowledge is a little fuzzy. But I'm just at a high level. This is what I think is going on. Um, Now, what's interesting here, though, is the influence of these magnetic fields on the neurons, which may help speed up object recognition, is not going to be perfect. Okay, so um, in broad daylight, it might be almost perfect, but maybe an error rate of a little less than 1 in 10,000 or something like that. But if it's at night, maybe the error rate is higher, 1 in 1,000 or whatever. Um, so what that means is if it's broad daylight and I'm in the woods, I probably see 10,000 bears before I might misinterpret one of the bears as being Bigfoot. Whereas at night, I might see 100 bears before I'm statistically likely to misinterpret one of them as being Bigfoot. Okay? So some of these perceptual errors caused by uh, the influence of magnetic fields on on the synapses, on this timing of the spiking of the neurons. Um, Mostly these are good things, right? Because they help us perceive things just a few milliseconds quicker than otherwise we would, which enables us to recognize the poisonous snakes and so forth. So there's a selective advantage, but every now and again it has incorrect information, which causes us to accidentally misinterpret a bear as being Bigfoot, for example. Um, so it's quite an interesting thing, but uh, I guess I wanted to kind of make a couple points here that if we uh, view consciousness as being the electromagnetic fields of the brain, it explains how what's called a binding problem, but how these different pieces of data are stitched together, and that's because you know uh, the phenomenological experiences in the magnetic fields which emerge out of all the different sort of subnets or neural networks of the neocortex. That's not new. That it's not a new concept that the electromagnetic models of consciousness solve the binding problem. But what I'm saying is, how much of this is causal and how much of this is not causal, and I think a very small amount, 1% at best, is causal. But that 1% might be enough to speed up perceptions. So it explains, why we have these magnetic fields sort of let through the filter, the sieve, if you will, of natural selection in the first place, is because it does, provide a small selective advantage. Okay. So that small selective advantage might be enough to allow these, electromagnetic fields to kind of be in there and doing their thing. But it also explains, secondly, leads to a large part paranormal phenomenon because these things aren't perfect, and so the electromagnetic influence. Long story short, not knowing all the neurological details, I'm not a neuroscientist, but long story short, it helps us perceive objects faster. Okay, um, but the speed is sort of at a cost to accuracy. Like if you're in software development, if you're doing things faster, you're going to make mistakes. So we can recognize things faster than otherwise we would without the help of the sort of the magnetic fields of the brain, but at a cost that sometimes it makes mistakes and sometimes it mistakes bears for Bigfoot and so forth. So the electromagnetic field model of consciousness can explain not only the binding problem, but also the mistakes that it makes can explain, um, at least the beginning of paranormal phenomena. Um, a story I like to think about a little bit, the Betty and Barney alien abduction story from 1965. And what's interesting about it is when I was a kid, my family would vacation up in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. And one of those mountains, a mountain called Cannon Mountain. And so what was happening was Betty and Barney Hill were driving home at night, and it's very dark, no street lights. Even to this day, there's not many street lights in those remote mountain roads in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. Uh, these winding roads late at night, and at the time there was a ranger station with a searchlight on top of Cannon Mountain, um, and they mistook this ranger light, this sort of searchlight on top of Cannon Mountain, for a UFO. And then with recountings over the years and going to unscrupulous hypnotists and stuff who kind of, through the power of suggestion or whatever, got them to sort of have some false memories about it, it turned from a UFO sighting into a full blown abduction case. And that's where the phenomenon of alien abduction stories really started in our culture. So that by 20 years later, in the 80s, there was a lot of abduction stories, and there was movies being made about it. And of course, that influenced the later TV show X Files, which I love that as a show. Um, but of course it's fictional. And this notion that aliens are abducting people and doing experiments on them and so forth. At least in part, this was popularized by the Betty and Barney Hill abduction story that happened in 1965, and it really just originated at the very beginning. At least it's theorized that they were driving near Cannon Mountain in the White Mountains of New Hampshire and thought that a searchlight on top of the mountain was a UFO, which is kind of an easy mistake to make if you're tired, it's dark, and so forth. You've been driving a long time. Okay, so that's just one small little example or anecdote there, but um, the brain isn't perfect. It's very good in the sense of it's helped us survive all these years and um, get to where we are now, but it's not perfect. And I use the poisonous snake analogy because there was kind of an arms race, really, for millions of years in sub-Saharan Africa between primates and snakes. Right, the snakes would be able to camouflage themselves uh, so that the primates couldn't detect them. But then the primates started getting better eyesight so that they would be able to detect them better, right? So it was kind of an arms race between the camouflage of the snake and the eyesight of the primates. So flash forward till today, the African apes, the great apes of Africa, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and humans, Homo sapiens, were the great apes of Africa. We have the best eyesight of all the other primates, or really mammals, I think, in general. I'm not sure about insects and fish and so forth, but at least of mammals, the primates, the great apes of Africa, again, which are the chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and human beings, we have the best eyesight, and of the great apes, we human beings have the best eyesight. And it's theorized that we had the best eyesight because we had to be able to spot the camouflage and so forth of these snakes and pick out which ones were poisonous and which ones weren't. Um, which is probably why there's a cultural fear of snakes because it's probably inherited, but that's kind of a separate issue. Um, so we have very good eyesight as primates to be able to detect snakes and so forth. Okay, but again, it's not perfect, and I think the magnetic influence on the spiking of the neurons in the brain uh, just makes this recognition faster, and it might make it faster by 5 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds. But a 5 or 10 milliseconds might be enough to jump out of the way just in time when a snake's trying to strike you. That extra few milliseconds might be the difference between life and death in the jungle, right? So I think there is a selective advantage to allowing these sort of mostly, if you will, epiphenomenalist fields to be there. And again, in this view, again, I'm not really moving my hand right now. I'm observing my motor neurons moving my hand, right? It's kind of a weird way to think about things. But what is also true is I can recognize things faster, and I'm a lot less likely to be bit by a poisonous snake than a dog or a cat. So I'll take that trade off. Even though also the penalty for it is I might occasionally mistake. A brown bear for a Bigfoot, or maybe a black bear for a Bigfoot. But anyway, so there's always trade offs. But I just think I just wanted to make a short video with these remarks about how viewing consciousness as being the electromagnetic fields created by the neocortex um, may explain both how we can recognize objects faster than other types of animals, um, and also, or at least contribute to how we recognize things faster, but also recognize that because this process of faster recognition is imperfect, that creates the occasional experience of the paranormal, which can be a simple, silly little thing. Oh, I thought I saw Bigfoot, or it could get sort of exaggerated in the culture and the retelling of it into like alien abduction stories, like with Betty and Barney Hill. So it's quite fascinating. But I just think the electromagnetic field theory of consciousness really explains and makes sense of a lot of things. So I wanted to make this video. I might make another video later, circling back to my paper about how to kind of you know determine if biological or AI systems are conscious enough by using or conscious or not by using the concept of Shannon entropy. But just so I can keep my mind on target here before I forget things, I want to make a short video. Thank you very much.